Hey, welcome everybody to Pro Mindset Podcast. This is your host, Craig Doman, and I have a young lady today that has wears a couple different hats. Her name is Lorena Martin. She's a professor at USC, University of Southern California, and she also works with professional sports leagues, professional sports teams, and professional athletes as a consultant. Lorena, welcome to Pro Mindset.
Thank you so much, Craig, for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, so you're like a new age scientist for athletes to figure out, like what's holding them from being their best. You're into biometrics, you're into analytics, all these words that kind of describe, scare people. They kind of like intimidate old school thought in terms of athletics. And then there's this whole new wave of people in front offices that absolutely love people that do what you do because they're mad scientists. They want to know why this athlete is performing at this high level and this other one's not. So why don't you share for a second what your definition of what you do is and how it shows up on the court or on the field?
Absolutely. Well, that's a great introduction and really adequate and accurate in terms of what happens in the environment in pro sports, right? So when we step in there, there's a lot of scouts and coaches, and they kind of maybe get a little bit, they're a little skeptical about the data science aspect. And then you have a lot of front office newbies, I would say new, modern executive front office that really want to incorporate analytics. So analytics is really just looking at these key performance indicators that we find relevant to the different sports, and not only the different sports, by player position, by gender. What's really important for maybe a quarterback versus a wide receiver? What should we be measuring for them? Okay, and of course, the scouts and the coaches have years of experience, and I almost, I explain it to my students as if they are human machine learning algorithms. Like they've already seen so much, right? That they actually kind of do the math intrinsically behind their head without doing actual math, but they've seen the right skill. They've seen what works out. And even like, for instance, if you look at like Patrick Mahomes last night, I mean, that was amazing, right? The way he always came through and his whole team. Andy Reid having being able to trust in his players. That's another component that we don't measure as well in analytics. So I always talk to students, you can't just only go by measuring the biometrics and the physical agility and how high they jump. There's also that factor that you in particular speak about, that pro mindset. How do we capture that? Right. And so that's more difficult to quantify. But in a nutshell, pretty much what I do is I get values, numerical values for the KPIs that we find that are relevant to that athlete's performance. And we try to identify, okay, where are they in terms of the average? We can compare them to themselves as well as to others that are great at what they do in their specific sport. And then from there, try and utilize that to reduce injury by looking at how much they're loading, as well as also looking at when would be the right time for them to peak. I mean, there's a lot to unravel there, but.
Okay, Lorena, you brought up Patrick Mahomes, one of my favorite players.
Yeah.
He plays quarterback. Playing quarterback in the NFL has to be one of the top 3 most difficult positions for an athlete to play. You're under a constant scrutiny by your organization. Your teammates are checking you out. The media, the fans. If things go well, you're a hero. If things don't go well, they want the QB2 to jump in and play. What are the key performance indicators that and the data points that you've discovered through your research for quarterbacks?
All right, so that's a great question. Well, one, so in the physical aspect, I would say definitely having that range of motion is fundamental, ideally. So let's go first through the physical, and then we're going to get into like the psychological aspects here. But I would go first through the physicality. Do they even have that external rotation that they need to have? Have they had previous injuries where maybe they're limited and they're not able to throw as good as they actually can. Sometimes that's overlooked. They go straight into strengthening without having the full range of motion. So you don't see the potential that they truly have. So maybe getting the range of motion set first, then the strengthening, and then having that endurance of being able to throw the ball over and over. That's just like the basic. Now, if you're talking at the elite level, I would look at their vision. I would also assess their, how would we call it? Football IQ, right? Some people have this, some people don't. I thought last night, with this Bo Nix being relatively new, I thought he was phenomenal. I thought he did a great job. I mean, especially going up against an undefeated team like the Kansas City Chiefs. But also, he also didn't have a lot of pressure, right? Because, they're not expected to win. So really what's even more fascinating to look at is how Mahomes handles that pressure and how do we quantify that? So objectively, what I get my students to do is I say, okay, we don't know really what's going on inside of his head. I wish we could, something similar to like Tom Brady's mentality, but I assume, but we can see, how does he perform in clutch moments? How does he perform like when they went for the conversion on the fourth down, right? They find a way to win.
Okay, so that's where the crossover is with pro mindset. Pro mindset is, how do you perform your best in your biggest moments? Because if you can perform well when it doesn't matter, when it doesn't count, when your team is winning by 4 touchdowns or losing by 4 touchdowns, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't really tell us anything. But when you can perform when there's 13 seconds to go in the game, like Patrick did against the Bills a few years ago, and Patrick's done in 2 consecutive Super Bowls where he's been behind going into the fourth quarter, he just has, like, they call him ice veins. He's one of those guys that's got, he's just so good under pressure. But what people don't understand is that pressure for him and pressure for other people may not be the same. And what other people see as pressure, I feel like Patrick Mahomes sees it as, this is just who I am and what I do. And so think about the thoughts before the play when Andy Reid, said, hey, let's go for it on fourth down instead of taking a field goal. Some quarterbacks will be going, oh gosh, I hope I don't screw this up because we could definitely get 3. Oh snap, what's the media gonna say? They're having all these thoughts in a nanosecond.
That's right.
And then they flash back to the last time they were in that situation where they didn't succeed, and they go, I hope it's not like that. What does Patrick Mahomes do? I don't know. But I'm guessing he goes, hey, we got this. This is just, every time we go for it, we're going to make it, And it's like he's just got a whole different energy about how he approaches the challenge, that everybody, the broadcasters and everybody makes it like, this is a big deal. Still just one play. You got 1 down to get 1 yard or whatever it might be. It's just that it is what it is, right? And I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to give you one more thought. Let's take the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is notorious for having guys showed up in the Super Bowl that really didn't show up the rest of the year. And then you guys have guys like Cam Newton, who was an MVP of the NFL that year that the Carolina Panthers went to the Super Bowl and played the Broncos. And he mailed it in. He was horrible. He got sacked a couple times by the Bronco DNs. Next thing you know, he was just thinking about, I just got to get out of this game without getting hurt. And I almost thought Patrick Mahomes last night was thinking about that because the Broncos were bringing the heat. But the point, Lorena, is that we don't all see pressure the same. And we can't measure, can we? Can we measure how they think about themselves? And because that's dynamic too.
Yeah. So no, you brought up excellent points. And going back to that point, because there's so many good snippets of information that you mentioned in there. One was pressure and how he sees it versus how some others see it. So we know based off of psychological research and evidence, and I know this part is boring, but we do know that players who see pressure as an opportunity and facilitate it, they end up performing better than those that see it as, oh, there's so much on the line. And then, they know that there's a lot on the line, but they have the capacity or the ability to move and not think about that. And you also brought up, do they go back to their replays of, oh, the last time I did this, did I do a good job or did I fumble it, right? Or did I mess it up? Not fumble it as in fumble it, but did I choke, right?
Right.
If the player has choked before, there is a much greater propensity for them to choke, unfortunately. So I would say to gear away from having them go for it in that area, unless they have done it in simulations during practice and they have overcome that. That's not to say that because they've choked before, they cannot make it happen this time, but they have to have been constantly working at it, to be honest with you. And I think that, for instance, I do believe, this is my personal opinion without the data, I do believe Mahomes taps into his own belief from previous successes that he's had. Like, we've done this, we've got this. And so we're going to do it. The other thing that it's close, and it's close in that psychological domain, and then I'll address, can we measure it or not, is anxiety and arousal levels. So there are a lot of players, like you mentioned, that they, get amped up and they're ready to go. Actually, I don't know if you mentioned that, but you were alluding to the fact that some players, when it comes to pressure situations, if there is no pressure, they're performing great. And if there is pressure, they're not performing that well. One of the things that we do know is that when players perform really good is when they are faced with an equal challenge of equal skill level. So not that the challenge is too high and not that the challenge is too low, which also breeds boredom and apathy. So if their challenge is equally met, it makes it for a really nice game, and it allows the opportunity. It doesn't mean that they will. It allows for the opportunity for them to get into the flow state and to perform at their optimal level. So that is something pretty interesting about that. And one last thing that I'll make a note on it will be that if an athlete has anxiety, if they interpret it like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of pressure, I'm nervous, this is not good, they're going to perform poorly. If they see their anxiety and that pressure as an opportunity and like excitement, we know that it's facilitative and they can actually end up performing well. And one of the things we know is that from anecdotal evidence from other professional athletes in different sports, they say they're not ready to compete unless they feel that anxiety and that nervousness. That's an indicator that they are ready. Versus somebody who doesn't perform well and usually feels that anxiety and arousal and feels like, oh my gosh, I'm not ready, right? And then they have different performance outcomes. And how do we measure it? So one is by the actual outcome in the game. How did they perform? Okay, did they go for it in the fourth down? And then what was the outcome? And then we can statistically measure it over time, track it. So actual observable data points. The other thing is there are some psychological assessments that use reaction time. And I worked on this with a couple of baseball players, not while I was at the professional baseball team, but individual professional athletes and baseball players in particular. And some had the yips, like where they get into a slump. It's a whole nother conversation. But to answer your question, there is a computerized task that looks at their reaction towards words and stimuli. And it's that implicit reaction that we look for to see what they really believe about themselves and how they're going to perform.
Well, two things. One is that coaches inadvertently reinforce choking to players that choke because they constantly remind them that you choked. We can't choke. We can't fail. You can't throw a pick. You can't make a bad decision. Coaches have a tendency to coach with negative words, negative thoughts, negative reinforcements, and bad memories. So here you have this athlete wanting to change the narrative, wanting the next opportunity he gets or she gets to be the clutch player is inhibited in a lot of ways by the coach and the coaching messages. The second thing is I have looked at circumstances and outcomes, scoreboard watching, expectations, all these things that are consequences of a player's performance. So while you're in the heat of the competition, when your mind leaves the moment and goes to the future, you start watching the scoreboard. You start thinking about partying after the game, who you're going to go out to dinner with, what you're going to say in your post-game interview, how you're going to be the hero that they're going to carry off after the game. Those things are performance busters. You cannot perform your best when you are not in the moment. The second aspect of that is when you talked about getting in the zone. I feel like the only way a player can get in the zone is it's when they detach from the potential outcomes and they're fully embodying who they are as an athlete, a person, a competitor, and a teammate in that moment. And when they do that, they have unbelievable positive self-talk. I call it their pocket voice. They've created this performance bubble that they've stepped into that protects them from all those negative things, doubts, fears, past failures, past disappointments, bad media coverage, dog cussing from the coach, all these things, what their parents said, what their girlfriend or boyfriend said before they walked on the field. And so what I've kind of come up with is the key performance indicators I've come up with is protecting being intentional about your identity, being transparent and honest about what your capabilities and abilities, what standards you need to up-level to grow into who you think you want to be and perform like you want to perform. And lastly is creating that performance bubble so that you can regulate your emotions while you're performing with only positive thoughts. Give me your thoughts on that.
Oh, I think you're on it. I mean, to be honest with you, I forgot to mention that being present in the moment, 100%, being present in the moment. I like what you mentioned about being honest about yourself with your own capabilities, because sometimes if the athlete wants to go and, far exceed what they're capable of at the current moment, we know where they want to go in the future, then that also is not realistic in the moment in terms of what they can achieve. Also, as you mentioned, that performance bubble, I love it, because it's almost like okay, you're in your safe space. Nothing is I'm not gonna allow it to interfere. Or if something is trying to interfere, I'm assuming that it would bounce out from the performance bubble, like you block it out, which is very nice. It's a nice visual to even have. As well as the other part that you mentioned about not worrying about the consequences in order for them to get in the flow. Absolutely right. They cannot be thinking about the consequences. The consequences are going to come regardless, and you don't have control over that. You only have control over your own state and your emotional regulation that you brought up. And a lot of times you can see that a lot of athletes fail to have that emotional regulation that they need. And that's a huge area that they could work on that's going to make them a heap better in their actual performance. Not to give you a percentage number yet, but no, I think those are really excellent key performance indicators that you've come up with and identified on your own, on your side.
Yeah, these are not scientific. They are, as you mentioned and alluded to in the beginning, scouts use analytics. They just don't call it analytics. I just had a college coach call me yesterday and said, "Hey, I've got a young man that should be, be a great prospect for you." And my question back to him was, who did you play with that he reminds you of? What characteristics does he have? So I could have him tell me someone that was successful, that they were this similar players, similar mindset, similar, characteristics. That's what scouts do. So instead of like trying to figure out what breaking down the athlete's psychology, they just go, we want another Kobe. We want another Steph Curry. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
he reminds me of Steph. Now, they don't use that. They don't throw that around very often. But if they ever say, hey, this guy reminds me of Steph Curry, that opens up a whole Pandora's box of, oh my God, this guy's a winner. This guy, it doesn't matter what he looks like. He's going to play bigger than, he's going to be that guy that's going to be a championship type player. Thoughts on that?
No, 100%. I do think that I do think that scouts and coaches, as I mentioned, they have their own internal human machine learning based off of the number of years of experience and also how successful they've been at it, right? Because, I mean, they could also have a faulty machine learning process where they're not that great at it. So where I think data comes in to help out is it helps support what they're thinking. It's supposed to be meant to support. And also, it's very important for the data scientist or the sports scientist to put the numerical values into context. Now, I hate saying this because I'm all about diversity and inclusion and everything, but I have a snippet of information that I like to tell the data science students, obviously not so bluntly, but it would be if you just get the numbers and you don't put it into context, you're making a critical error. So besides collecting the data correctly, identifying the right key performance indicators for the sport, the player position, the type of athlete that they are, team setting, individual setting, besides doing all of that, besides knowing all of your modeling, the statistical analyses that we have a gamut of, besides knowing how to code it, at the end, there's two really important things that you have to be able to do. One is interpret it and put it into context. And the other one is communicate it to the key stakeholders. You have to be able to communicate it to the coach in a way that they will buy in and not shut you out. You have to be able to communicate it to the player where he's interested and doesn't feel, one, that the data is going to be used against them, or two, that they don't know what you're talking about because you're using statistical jargon. So I also, try to help and mentor them into doing this. And then the point about the interpretation of the values I bring up. So imagine if you were to say, if you look at just numbers and you don't put it into context, you would say that the average human, and this is not to offend anybody or anything, but this is actually meant to serve as a helpful tool for anybody understanding statistics and why you have to put the data into context. And what I say is, if you didn't put it into context, then you would say that an average human, regardless of male or female, has one testicle. The average human has one testicle. When you put it into context, then you identify, oh, most men have, most women would have none, right? So you have to put it into context, and then that's where the average comes out to one. But, a lot of, and I think this is part of the rift that comes between the coaching and scouting and maybe some of the analytics is maybe you're getting a bunch of data scientists that are not putting it into context and that are also not conveying the information in a way that is understandable and digestible. I remember working with a colleague of mine in a professional basketball team. I'm not going to say which, but he literally had to hire another person to communicate the information to the coaches and the scouts, even though he did all the work. He didn't want the credit. He didn't even care. He's just like, I can't talk to them. And I was like, are you kidding? It's the easiest part of it, but he couldn't. He did all the modeling, and then he literally hired someone to convey that information to the coaches. And it's really meant to support what they're already having their good hunches on. But sometimes it can also help bring out, hey, there's an alert coming, like this player is about to get hurt, that maybe you can't really see that part like 2 to 3 weeks in advance. And you have a lot of players in particular in football that you have to be accountable, responsible for. So the analytics can help point out, hey, pay attention to this one. This one's about to get hurt. So, I think it's best utilized in that form.
Just out of curiosity, what data do you guys collect that helps predict potential future injury?
Okay. So one of the most common ones, I can't give you all my secrets here, but I would say that we definitely capture duration and intensity. So how long are they out on the field? And obviously this varies by sport, because if you're also thinking about like the seasons of football, it's a lot shorter technically than baseball and tennis all year round, and basketball 82 week I'm sorry, 82 games. Yeah. And so looking at the duration, but not only the duration of the season, the duration of the training session, and also looking at the intent, how hard they're going at it every day. Is practice simulating the game time or not? Sometimes you want it to, sometimes it's overkill. And then so we look at certain peaks, and if, I have a certain algorithm, and then there are others that also have certain algorithms based off of acute to chronic workload ratio, which is really important. I think it is. I think it's helpful, and I think it just needs to be tweaked towards the sport and player position and other things that I include to weigh different areas wrong. And you can kind of see, oh, things are trending the wrong way. This is a player you want to keep an eye on. You also have to take into account the player's personality. I've worked with players that were very transparent at saying, yeah, my intensity was pretty high or it was pretty low, and they're very honest about it. Whereas I've also worked with professional players that are currently playing in the pros right now, and they would tell me the same number every day, which was false. Technically, they were just giving me a same number. Just to give you an example, oh, today it's a 3, it's a 3, it's a 3. But then when I checked in on him, and when I'm talking about a 3, we also use this rate of perceived exertion, which is it's kind of standard even across the world in terms of soccer, football, baseball, basketball, tennis. And really, we have found that it's really critical to actually ask the athlete on a scale of 0 to 10, how hard do you feel you worked? And even though that is more subjective, it was first initially brought out by a psychologist, and the scale was 6 to 20. The scale was originally 6 to 20. On a scale of 6 to 20, how hard do you feel you worked? What happened was that he identified and found the correlation with, if they would say they were at a 16, it was correlated with their heartbeats at 160 beats per minute. If they said it was a 12, it was correlated to their heart rate of 120 beats per minute. And then we basically kind of scaled it to 0 to 10, because we found that everybody was always asking the question, well, why not 0 to 10 instead of 6 to 20? That's one of the reasons it was scaled down. But anyhow, we have found that part to be very accurate in terms of helping us identify what they feel the intensity was. And going back to that athlete, when he mentioned a couple times later on that he was a 7 after saying 3, 3, 3, then we knew something was wrong there. Just even looking at his self-reported intensity. Now, of course, we have Catapult, WeMove, FirePod, all of Connexon, all these wearable techs that give you the heart rate, which is a good indicator of intensity, but also matching it up with duration, we can weigh things differently, and we get what is called load. Sorry, that's a lot.
No, I get it. So load is important, and coaches can manage load. What I think is really, for what I've seen with my athletes, probably the biggest indicator is recovery. So if it takes them longer to recover, if the extremes of what they have to do to feel right to go practice or get ready for a game or get shot up with Toradol or whatever it may be so that they can play, that is a very serious indicator that there's a lingering effect from previous performances. And so they haven't fully recovered. And so as long as and maybe they're not getting their sleep, maybe it could be some of those things too. Maybe they're not getting their nutrition. So if they're recovering from an increased load, that doesn't bother me because they're still recovering. But it's when they're recovering. So for me, just, talking to my people, the recovery is the first signal, because if they can't recover, it's inevitable they're going to get hurt at some point.
Okay, so I do believe in the recovery of big time. And as a matter of fact, you can even see that in the heart rate through heart rate variability. If they have a tendency to recover quickly, we can measure that through their heart rate variability, and we see that during load. But I would stress the importance of capturing the load during practice, because if you have, let's say, a coach, now this shouldn't be happening at the elite levels, but I've seen it happen a couple of times. If they're continuing to let's, if you even think about like spring training or training camp, you know, isn't necessary for the players to wake up so early and train so hard during spring training. When you're trying to ramp them up, they're going to just get injured, right? If you're just going to go, if you think you're taking the player from off season and boom, throwing them in and trying to get them up to 80% of their max within a very short amount of time. Ideally, you'd want to, you got to get the engine back working. You got to warm it up a little bit, and it takes its time. Then after the load, I definitely go with recovery. I also look at if they're older, it does take longer to recover. So they have to spend more time doing recovery modalities. For instance, like soft tissue, not necessarily icing. That depends on the player. If they like icing, there's like some controversy about the icing, ice cold baths. But contrast is known to be very effective. Dipping in the cold, then dipping in warm. Also like cupping, acupuncture, compression, definitely a huge thing. But I would say recovery is most important once you've got the right recipe for how you should be training and loading them. If you have a coach who's like training them obsessively and like telling them, to continue to run and train, and we're seeing high peaks on terms of the duration and intensity over time, even if they were to recover really well, they could get hurt. Which is going to require them to recover take a lot longer to recover. So assuming that they are training correctly and you have a good strength coach that knows how to, format it for whatever player position it is in whatever sport, then I would say 100% recovery is really critical. And sleep, we know that that's a low-hanging fruit that many of them just toss out. And we know that it even delays their reaction time by lack of sleep. It could even be similar to that of a person drinking under the influence in terms of reaction. How are you going to go and swing a bat at a 90-mile-per-hour fastball as good as you can? You still can, but as good as you possibly could had you slept better,
No doubt.
Those are some thoughts. I would love to debate more.
I like your thoughts. Let me ask you this. Let's focus on football for a second. You made a very good point that I don't think I've ever heard anybody mention before, because training camp is such a shock to these guys' bodies. It's a shock to their mind. It's a shock to their schedule. You can't simulate it in advance. Some guys train too hard in anticipation of training camp, and then they're exhausted when they show up. And then some people don't train hard enough, and then they end up with a pulled hamstring or some soft tissue injury because they're overloading their body in comparison to what they were doing before they showed up for camp. So with all those are all normal things that happen. What's the blind spot by NFL teams that if you were the performance coach or VP of performance at a team, you would say, this is how we're going to do it so that we can maximize their performances, their health?
I'd have to give that some thought because number one, you don't want to ruffle too many feathers because then you're not going to get any buy-in. So is this assuming that everybody's like, yeah, okay, we like her and we're going to listen to her and everything's okay. Okay.
The owner calls you and says, hey, I want you to be my person. What do you change? What's the thing you change?
But you got to still remember, even if the owner says that, you're still getting, I've been in these positions, you still get some pushback from scope. Yeah, 100%. So you don't want to change things too much ultimately. So if I had the leeway and everybody was on board, definitely I would look at what we've been doing and I would look at the rate at which they get hurt. I would compare it to what other teams have. So this would be my first initial response would be, let me first see what's happening. Let me get a lay of the land and compare it to what other teams have done and their rates of injuries and how their training camp goes. Of course, we would like to revolutionize it possibly just a tad, but you don't want to, maybe with like a small change in the beginning. Probably I would change the intensity first, the intensity that they start at. The intensity would be the first thing. Yes, you want to be intense, and that's part of the training camp and everything. But is that more important? Is tradition more important than them actually getting hurt and you throwing out millions of dollars and on your star player that could have been ready to go, or putting them in position to get hurt a lot sooner than they could have, had they warmed up the right way. So first, I would say intensity, because you do need duration first. You need to start building up that duration. So like the endurance. So maybe, going long hours, but maybe at a lower, I would minimize the volume and the intensity first. And I would say what's appropriate for you all. And I wouldn't do it by that one, like in research, we know that every time that you're going to increase for performance without injury, you want to maybe increase about 5% per week. Obviously, training camp, you can't, do this, but I would decrease a certain percentage in terms of intensity and volume in the beginning.
Okay. What is the when you deal with athletes, what's their blind spot? What do they think that they're doing that they really shouldn't be doing? And what do they it's right in plain sight that they should be doing that they don't think it's as important as it really is?
I can give you a perfect example of this one, right? Just a player that I was working with individually, and then he's in the NBA right now, and he's playing like literally this week and everything. He was so focused on his physical KPIs, and they are important, right? They really are important, but in terms of speed and how fast they are and agile, but he was yielding, and this would be in basketball, he was yielding a higher rate of turnovers. So maybe that's something that, yes, it's great that you have that speed and it's great that you have that agility, but you need to control it, right? And maybe it's actually detrimental to your performance because you're not harnessing it right yet. So maybe going a little slower and having less turnovers would be better. So sometimes our blind spots is that they think that their strengths are not maybe hurting other areas, which maybe, it's definitely important and great to have your strengths, but is there an area maybe that you're neglecting because you're only looking at your strengths, where you could become a more well-rounded player and not have that weak link in another area? Also, their agents sometimes, and I know that you're an NFL agent, so their agents are very protective. I've had a good rapport with the agents, because I'm always trying to look out for, and I obviously I've worked for the teams, and I want the best. I want to do the best for the teams as well as for the player. And that could be conflicting at times, but the thing with the player is, and the agent, we want to get their buy-in with the data so that we can help them perform better. And now I think there's that actually has taken care of itself, because the CBAs in different teams and actually in different leagues, has kind of addressed that issue, at least in the NBA and MLB and NFL. Not so much in MLS yet, though.
Well, one of the things that I find with athletes is that they get bored with the main thing being the main thing. They just get bored. And so they start majoring in the minors, and they start focusing on the things that, might help them by 1/10 of 1%, and they're neglecting the things that can help them by 50%. Something that the big rocks, so to speak. And so I really do think as players get older, they fall into one of two categories. They really keep the main thing the focus, and they are very efficient with their time, and they're good family guys, and they get away from the sport so they can get some freshness when they come back. Or they fall into the category of it's something different than what it really is, and they're focusing on the wrong things, and they're looking for the newest fad, the newest treatment, the newest whatever it is. They're chasing it instead of just relaxing and keeping the main thing their focus. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Sometimes, they don't want to address what they have to address. It's like non-negotiable. So then that's why they're looking for these little pieces here and there. And, can I get that newest recovery, modality applied? And yeah, it can help if you're non-negotiable in the other areas, but maybe you really need to go back and really address certain things, right? So, some examples that I think about that come to mind, obviously now this is already, I'm trying to think about like an older athlete that had to change something even at an older age. Well, if you look at Nadal in tennis, I mean, he's won the French Open, more than anybody else ever. I think it's 15 times. And even when he had won it 5 times, he still went and changed his serve. Like, he addressed things that another elite top pro player would probably not even look at. So he had that open mentality, like, I need to address this and make it stronger. I also need to be able to come maybe a little bit more to the net to save my knees. And like, so he was really efficient and smart about the areas that he had to address, even though they would have been more difficult than other little things like you're mentioning. Um, the other thing was, who else had to address something that has been successful at this?
Tiger Woods did that with his swing after
Yep.
about 10, 15 years on the tour.
And
Totally
and
changed
then
his swing.
and the good results.
Good
I
result.
mean, yeah, good results, good
Sometimes
results.
pitchers will add pitches, in major MLB. They lose a mile or two per hour on their fastball. So they have to have another tool in their toolbox because they can't throw with the same velocity, but they can be more artsy about their game. So they're adding more skills to their repertoire, so to speak. But I do think I see sometimes where the players that are the best, yes, they're freaky athletes, they're dedicated, all those things. But they keep it simple. They focus on the things they need to focus on and not try to make it too crazy.
And they also know their body. And this you made me think of somebody that came to mind. Now this is in swimming. Dara Torres. At the age of 42, she wanted to compete, and she did compete in the Olympics. And I can't recall if she got the silver medal. I can't recall. At the age of 42, I believe it was. But she ended up speaking about, mind you, I did not work with her, but I read her book. I also looked at her interviews and watched her interviews and read everything that you could about it. And she decreased her training in the swimming pool to, I would say, it must have been 1 hour and about 6 to 8 hours of stretching and recovery at that point, when usually it's kind of, in reverse, especially they're in the pool for hours and then stretching and recovering for like an hour. And so that goes to show you how she knew her body. She knew what she had to address for her. She did less is more in the pool and more in the stretching and recovery because she was an older athlete. But and it worked out well for her as well.
I think a lot of players, like in the NFL arena, once they hit 29 to 30, they start changing what they do because your body it just can't train the same. So a lot of things that college strength coaches have them do, really heavy lifts and things like that to grow and develop. By the time they get to the league, they start modifying it. And by the time they hit 30, they don't do it anymore at all because it just doesn't serve the purpose that it did when they were 18.
Yeah, so if you look at like Tom Brady, and his pliability, his TB12 method that he formulated, I thought it was a very interesting way to go about it, and utilizing all the knowledge that's out there and knowing his body very well for looking at having that range of motion, but that's also for his position, right? So it would be different for you're looking at a running back or a wide receiver. They probably, would need a little bit more of continuing a maintenance strengthening, right? So that they could keep up their explosivity and their power as much as they could. Although every step makes a difference, right? You can see that if they're short one step, you know.
Well, one thing that I've learned about Patrick Mahomes is he trains in, putting his body in awkward situations, different angles. He threw a pass last night, incomplete, where he just slung it. Didn't, it's almost like he'd done it before. He'd either visualized it or he trained for it, that, hey, he didn't want to take the sack. And he knew on that particular play, there was nobody in that area. So he just slung it. Most guys that do that kind of thing end up with an interception. But it's like, he's one of the beautiful things about Patrick is he's the first person I've known of, even more than, Manning and Brady and some of these unbelievable guys over the years. he has trained for all different types of throws, throwing angles, left hand, right hand, doesn't matter. And it's like it shows up in his game. He does not have the strongest arm in the NFL. He's not the fastest quarterback, but he's very effective.
Extremely effective.
Okay, we have not talked about you. Why don't you share with everybody what is your story? What is your involvement in sports? What is your previous history in perhaps psychology and statistics and analytics and things like that? And what got you to where you're at today?
All right. Yeah, everybody has a story. So my story was I was a tennis player, and I really wanted to become a professional tennis player. But I came from a low socioeconomic status background. Not to excuse it, because there are people that still make it, even, if they're recruited at the right time. But I started off playing a little bit late. I ended up working in an airline to travel to the tournaments. To give you an idea, I was trying to, but it didn't really work, because I would arrive and they had been their days acclimating to the new environment. So I remember traveling to Europe one time, to Portugal to play, got off the plane, took a couple of shots of coffee, and I'm off to go and play a professional match. They had been there. And usually, now we know with research that when you travel, every time zone that you cross, it usually takes about a day to acclimate for every time zone. And that there is different effects going from east to west and west to east. But anyhow, so going back to the story is, every time I got hurt, I was bored, and usually athletes, we always like to be doing something. So I would go back to school every time I was hurt. I had 2 knee surgeries, and in the meantime, I was really fascinated by what differentiated great athletes, legendary athletes, from, I would say, good professional athletes to poor athletes. And at first, I really wanted to get into the psychology of it, which is your emphasis. And because I did struggle with anxiety in the beginning, and it took me a long time to actually then realize that, oh, that anxiety before performance, it's a good way. If you see it as facilitative, it would help. But the whole time in the beginning, I was not seeing it that way. I was seeing it like there's something wrong, or maybe I'm not meant for this. And then later I realized, after hearing like a bunch of professional athletes say, oh, if I didn't feel like I had to puke before going to play, then I wasn't ready. Then I ended up with my a former coach who had been number 34 in the world, and she was like, of course, I've always had to go, puke before playing, and that's normal. And then when I thought about it, as in like, oh, that's normal, then I started playing better, performing, because it was a mindset. It was a mindset. But anyhow, I did my bachelor's in psych, and anybody that knows about psychology, that you get a strong background in statistics, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to measure these intangible constructs. And so you play with the numbers quite a bit to try and assess these numbers. Then I went on to the master's, and I got the master's in psychology, and I did some research with pro tennis players during that time. They're looking at confidence and performance on tennis players. And then I thought I had enough of psychology, so I shifted over to physiology, because I was like, okay, I've exhausted the psychological domain, or what I felt, and I did not want to be a therapist. I just wanted to analyze things. So I went into looking at the physiology of what's happening inside the body, heart rate variability, insulin spikes, glucose spikes, what's happening with your lung capacity when you're running, type 1, type 2 fiber distribution for different types of athletes. I loved it. I wanted to do sports research. And then, but there was no funding for sports research. But they said, hey, the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, they fund research in, helping people prevent chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And, we'd give you a postdoc at UC San Diego if, you'd come and utilize your skill set and help us out here with stats, and you'd get more training in biostats, epidemiology, and spatial analysis. So I said, okay, I'll go over there. At first, I was kind of just, a little down, because I was like, damn, I'm not going to work in pro sports, and that's really what I wanted to do. Obviously, I wanted to be the athlete. If not, then work in there. And but then I found it's interesting. I kind of let go, and I was like, wow, this is really meaningful. I'm helping people prevent chronic diseases through statistics, doing my part, I would say. And I kind of let go on it. I went to a conference, which was part of my training in coding and analysis. And there somebody spotted my background in sports and stats and said, why don't you write a book? And I'll also hire you as an adjunct at Northwestern to teach sports analytics and develop the course. And I said, okay, that's fine. But I didn't know what I was getting into with writing a book. But okay, I say it was like my baby. I popped it out after 9 months. Boom. And there was the book. And then after that, I got a call from the Lakers and they interviewed me and it was a great experience. I ended up working for Magic was my direct boss, Magic Johnson. Jeannie Buss was amazing. And then after professional basketball, working full time as the director of sports analytics for the Lakers, I ended up going to a professional baseball team as director of performance. I didn't want to leave the Lakers, but I was overseeing one department, and the new position was overseeing 6 departments: physical therapy, sports science, even the medical the medical director and orthopedic surgeon, nutrition. It was just physical therapists, athletic trainers, and strength and conditioning coaches, all of the above. So I went because I thought it would be a good move for my career. It was tough. I oversaw 300 professional baseball players, and I had a staff of 40, where only one of them was a woman. But I learned a lot. And then I took some time off, and I went into academia to share the information with the next generation. And I consult on the side with athletes and teams individually. And that's my whole story in a nutshell, kind of.
That's awesome. Let me ask you this, Lorena. If you had the opportunity to go back to the professional baseball team again and have a staff of 40 and be one of 2 women and have, their minor league teams as well, what would you do differently based upon what you know now? Or maybe what would you do differently? How would you show up differently based upon who you are now?
That's a tough one. One, for legal reasons, and 2, because it is a tough one. What I can say is I was very true to myself. And I know that individuals who kind of maybe go more with the flow would have maybe be better off. But like that was that example. I'm gonna switch it here, but kind of get to it in a way without as much as I can. That example that you brought up of being a VP and an NFL team, etc. Right? Me gun-ho before, so that way I'm not talking about the baseball team, I'm talking about the football team. Me gun-ho before, I would have been like, okay, great. This is what you guys, come on. This is what we need to change. This is what we need to change. It's obviously you're ramping them up. This is why we're getting more hamstring injuries. And, and I know this, but I would definitely not. That's why I said, do I have buy-in? And you said, yeah, you have ownership buy-in. That doesn't necessarily mean I have buy-in. I have to have buy-in from strength coaches, the trainers, you know what I mean? The scouting, everybody has to be in, and that takes a lot of time. So
May I interject something?
Yeah, go please.
When I'm sensing, and I'm putting words in your mouth, so if they're not accurate, you can say so. You would be a better salesperson, and you would have built consensus instead of maybe coming in and saying this is how it is, because in those organizations, they're like giant ships. They don't pivot very quickly. It takes a lot of radius to turn them to
That's a
do a
good
180.
analogy. That's a great analogy. That's a
It
great
is, because
analogy.
it's true.
Yeah, that's a
It's
great
true. These
analogy.
guys, it's a male dominant environment, and because they trusted the person that hired them 30 years ago, and they've been doing it for 30 years, that's just how it is. And they don't want, who wants change? None of us like change, right? I mean,
Yeah.
until you get in a growth mindset, you try to hide from change. Then you realize that's the only way through, moving forward is change. But you can't go up to somebody maybe twice your age and tell them, hey, we're going to do something differently, that's been doing it for decades. And so building a consensus and maybe allowing them to see for themselves that there's something here. Because like with teams, I've learned how to communicate with teams. I can't tell them anything. If I tell them something, they just give me the stiff arm every time. So I just go, well, I don't know what you think, but what do you think about this? And then I go, well, hell, he's pretty good. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, well, that's what I wanted you to see. And then obviously, if they don't see what you see, it's a dead end. But a lot of times it's got to be their idea. They got to connect the dots. All you do is present it, create an environment so that they can connect the dots. Because they're not going to take anything from you or anybody else. I mean, that's just the way it works.
Yep. Yep. So yeah, I cannot legally say anything else about, because I mean, I did a
That's
lot of
okay.
right. Just so you know, I did a lot of right things, and there was a bunch of other stuff in there. But you know, outside of that, I always take everything as a learning experience. And I do believe in karma, and but your example of turning the ship, that's true for any organization, and so yes, I would agree with that. Yeah,
Like my wife tells me I'm a man of analogies.
I like that one. I'm gonna
I don't
use
know
that
where I
one
get them,
I'm
but
gonna
I
use that
get
one.
them. That's how my brain works. Well, is there anything that you would like to share today? I'm looking at the clock and we're at a time where I want to bring this to a close, but if there's anything that you would like to share to the world.
No, that's it. Just you know, now with AI coming in, just be careful. Don't take everything that AI and ChatGPT say for beta, you know, like just at face value, because there have been times even coding, I check it up and it's a little bit off sometimes. So you have to know how to interpret the information. And other than that, fight on. You know, as we would say at USC. And it's been
Okay,
a
so if
pleasure. I
there's
want to thank you.
well, I want to thank you for being a guest on Pro Mindset. And I also want to make sure people can find you. There'll be show notes on the podcast, but if somebody wants to find you, how can they find you?
Yeah, sure. Besides the USC campus, healthandsportsanalytics.com. They can also email me at healthandsportsanalytics@gmail.com, and they'll get a hold of me for sure.
And what is the name of your book?
Sports Performance Measurement and Analytics. Yeah, that
How
is,
did
and
you
I need to update it. That was
you need to
2016.
update it? I'm sure I mean, that's a ever-changing field, right? So what year did you publish?
2016, and it is a great starter book for anybody, either the data scientist that doesn't know much about sports. It's really good for them because it gives them an overview of every sport, and also for somebody that's in sports that doesn't know much about coding or stats. It gives you like the beginnings of like, here's what you should necessarily, what you must know to, you know, be able to analyze the basics and some basic stats algorithms. But it doesn't include the machine learning algorithms, which I would probably include in the next one, if I ever get the courage to write another book. But yeah,
Yeah. No, I get it. No, writing a book is an adventure for sure.
I saw that you have your nice book there. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun stuff. Well, I want to thank you again for being on Pro Mindset. Wish you nothing but the best.
absolutely. No, thank you so much. And thank you for having me on.